Good evening. You know, after having worked for so many years as an evening news anchor, I have to tell you, just for a moment, I was tempted to say, good evening, our top story tonight, or good evening, breaking news, this just into Norristown. Old habits die hard. Seriously, the only thing in 24 years of anchoring the evening news that I was not allowed to say, the only phrase was, the big story is, and that's because that phrase is used by the competition, which I know sounds a little silly, and certainly that part of the job I don't miss. But what I do miss is the opportunity to tell important stories, big stories, stories that matter, which is why I am so very excited and so very passionate about being here with you tonight, because I have a big story. I get to say that now. I have a big story to tell, but it's an untold story, and I want to change that. I would like for us to engage in some upside down thinking. I want us to turn thinking on its head. Now, as it turns out, we've all had a lot of experience with that, given the past year that we've had. 2017 was the year of upside down thinking, wasn't it? When events and occurrences challenged everything we had been led to believe. We were forced to conceive the inconceivable, imagine the unimaginable, and accept the unacceptable. Like, for example, a president who, instead of encouraging optimism and hope and unity, does just the opposite. Or an act of Mother Nature that forced us to accept not just one hurricane in a season, but 3. Now, I know all those examples I just gave you were very negative, and that's not what I'm seeking to do with this upside down thinking tonight. What I want us to do is, through looking at something through a different lens, a different perspective, to help us all start to tell this untold story about a disease that we probably think we know about, but that, well, my goal here tonight is to show you that perhaps there are some things you don't know about it. And I'm talking about Alzheimer's. Now, certainly it's been in the news a lot lately. Bill Gates just earlier this week announced that he was going to give $100 million of his own money to help find a cure. And just a few months ago, the Postal Service announced that they were issuing a commemorative stamp, and that's a great thing, because anytime these commemorative stamps come out, that means that much needed dollars are poured into research. Let's do some upside down thinking. The face on the stamp is of a very gentle, very kind-looking, elderly white woman. Upside down thinking. That is not the face of Alzheimer's. Hers is not the face of Alzheimer's. Please don't get me wrong, don't misunderstand. Obviously, elderly white men and women suffer from Alzheimer's, and it's a horrific disease having nothing at all to do with your race. And we have empathy, we have sympathy for anyone going through this. But when you start talking about the face of Alzheimer's, all the research tells us that if you are African American, if you are Native American, or you are Hispanic, you are twice as likely to have Alzheimer's. And when you talk about the economic burden of this disease, Dr. Daryl Gaskin at Johns Hopkins University did a study where he said, looking just at African Americans, we're about 13.6% of the population. And yet, when you look at the economic burden, 1/3 of the cost of Alzheimer's is shouldered by African Americans. That's because most of the cost associated with Alzheimer's has to do with caregiving. So, why are we more at risk? And what exactly is this disease? We'll get into that in just a little bit. But first, let's do a little bit more of this upside down thinking. We've already talked about the face of Alzheimer's. Now I want you to look at sort of what we expect as the way of the world, the natural order of things. The natural order of things is you're raised by, let's say, your parents, or maybe a grandparent, or an aunt, or a caregiver. You grow up, you venture out into the world, you meet someone, you have a child. We've all seen the circle of life from The Lion King. We know how that works. Except in the upside down world of Alzheimer's, because that circle of life actually goes in reverse. You may now be an adult, a parent with a child of your own, and yet your parent, due to no fault of their own, now needs you to do everything for them that was done for you as a child. Everything from watching them, to bathing them, to helping them with the most personal of bodily functions. Let's look at relationships, personal relationships, sexual relationships. We all expect our husbands and our wives to be faithful. And when they're not, all hell breaks loose, right? Seriously, there is nothing more painful, nothing more unaccepted in our society than infidelity, unless you're talking about the upside down world of Alzheimer's. Because if your spouse doesn't recognize you and they're in a care facility and they meet somebody, or they make an inappropriate comment to someone, maybe even a family member, sexual, you have to look at that interaction differently because of this disease. Taking it one step further, your spouse has Alzheimer's, you're fine, but you have needs. And yes, you took a vow to honor till death do you part, but in a sense, isn't this a form of death? Let's take a little break from this upside down thinking, because it really can kind of make you a little dizzy. What exactly is the disease, and why are we as African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans more at risk? First, what is the disease? I am 60 years old, and on any given day, I can walk into a room, get halfway into the room, and say, what in the heck did I come in here for? Or on any given day, drive my mom, drive my daughter crazy, saying, you know, where is my phone? Has anybody seen my keys? That is not Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a disease in the brain that, I guess the best way to sort of describe it, and I wish we had a diagram here, so I'm going to ask you to sort of play along with me on this, but our brains, 100 million neurons in your brain. Neurons are basically information cells. Neuron A sending information to neuron B through the space that the information is able to transfer through. That's what happens in a healthy brain. But in a brain with Alzheimer's, that space that I'm talking about, well, these sticky clumps of protein, researchers, experts call it amyloid beta, or they call it a plaque. Well, that starts to form in those spaces. So now the information cannot go from neuron A to neuron B. And as that information just sort of poofs, goes away, those cells which are responsible for transmitting the information, they die. And as they die, so dies memories. First short-term memories, then long-term memories, then the memory on how to speak, and eventually, unless there's some sort of secondary illness, this disease eventually progresses to the stage when you die. There is no cure, there is no treatment. That is the what of this horrific disease. Now let's get to the why. Why are we as African Americans, as Hispanics, as Native Americans more at risk? Well, certainly for a very small percentage of the population, if you, and this has nothing to do with race, this is if you're black or white, brown, doesn't matter. If you have a certain combination of a genetic mutation, you are going to get Alzheimer's. But that's a very small percentage. For the rest of the people, when you talk about why we are more at risk, well, I've asked this a lot of doctors and researchers, and they'll start off by telling you they really don't know why we're more at risk, but they do have some indicators. One of the indicators has to do with certain diseases which put you at risk. Diseases like hypertension and heart disease and stroke and diabetes. And right now you're starting to get the picture, because if these are diseases which put you more at risk, these are also diseases which disproportionately impact and affect African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans. So now you see the correlation. If these are diseases that increase your risk, and these are diseases that disproportionately impact marginalized communities, we understand why that's a problem. Another issue, stress. My God, are we not the most stressed people on the planet? Seriously, stress. Researchers in Sweden tell us that when they look at mice that are stressed, and I'm not quite sure how they stress the mice, but mice that are stressed have memory issues. When they do autopsies on the brains of these mice, once again they find these sorts of clumps of toxic protein that we were talking about, the same sorts of things that are in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. One of the things that I used to hear about a lot when I was doing the news, one of the criticisms, is that every day we would come into your home and we would give you nothing but problem after problem after problem. Seldom were there any solutions. True to form, I've come here tonight and I've laid out a host of problems. There are some solutions, though, that I just briefly want to talk about. When you talk about diseases that put you at risk, like diabetes, heart disease, all the research says that in most instances, certainly not all, but in most instances, a lifestyle change, changing how you eat, exercise, makes a difference. Stress, there are things we can do in terms of something as simple as breathing exercises or meditation makes a difference with stress. One of the best things we can do when we talk about a solution for Alzheimer's is get involved in a clinical trial. Now, I know when you say clinical trial, if we could have like thought bubbles out there, there would be one thought bubble that says, I don't want to be experimented on. And there would be another thought bubble that says, I'm not interested in being a guinea pig. And the third thought bubble way back there would be, don't you remember the Tuskegee syphilis experiments? And certainly that happened. From the 30s to the 70s, African-American men were experimented on. They were exposed to syphilis. It was not allowed to be treated. They suffered, they died. That is a fact. But what is also a fact is that after that, safeguards were implemented to make sure that that could not happen again. There is a pioneering geneticist and biologist named Dr. Goldie Bird, who is at North Carolina A&T. She has not only looked at the genetic link between Alzheimer's and African Americans, she's also worked on coming up with a protocol for clinical trials that don't just increase participation, but also engage communities and see what communities need and go into individuals' homes to bring them into the clinical trial process. That is serving as a model for clinical trials. And it's important to emphasize that the only way we're going to get a cure or even a treatment is through a clinical trial. And right now, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, woefully underrepresented in clinical trials. Now, I look out here and I see most of you are very young. You look like you're in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, and I'm sure you're thinking, yes, I have empathy for my parents, my grandparents. You may even think I have empathy for Renee, she's at that age. The truth is, by the time someone my age starts to show symptoms of Alzheimer's, those toxic plaque, the clumps that I was talking about, they have been developing for decades. So all the research is now looking at individuals in their 20s, their 30s, and 40s, getting them involved because that's where the best hope is in terms of getting at this plaque, in terms of trying to find a treatment. I just want to say something real quick about the solutions that I had touched on just a few moments ago about how if you change how you eat and if you exercise, that's certainly a way to get at some of these risk factors for certain diseases. That was accurate, but it wasn't really honest, because if an expert says to you, yes, you can, through healthy eating, eliminate diabetes, and yet you live in a community where there are no outlets for healthy food, or you don't have access to quality education that's going to prepare you for the job, to make the money, to buy the healthy food, then that's not really an honest solution. Or if you tell people to exercise and there are no green spaces in our community, or you step outside your door and it's broken pavement and it's unsafe, again, not an honest solution. And when we look at solutions to these problems, these inequalities, whether it's in access to health care or healthy food or adequate housing or education, When we look to the institutions for solutions to those problems, we tend to look to our elected officials, we tend to look to the courts, we may look to our community activists and leaders, maybe the media to shine a spotlight. One more exercise in upside down, on its side thinking is that I would suggest, in addition to those institutions being called upon, and they certainly have a responsibility to address these problems, but one of the elements, one of the aspects, one of the groups we need to look at are our doctors and our healthcare professionals. Because who is in a better position? They are on the front lines. They see the harmful effects of inadequate access to health care and quality food and inequalities in education. So they get the problem after the problem's already been created and asked to solve it. More to the point, whose voice is more respected? Who is more revered in our community than our doctors and our healthcare professionals? So I would say that their voice needs to be brought into this body of people who are looking to address this problem. Before I was a journalist, I was a lawyer. And one of my personal heroes was and still is Harvard Law professor Charles Ogletree. Brilliant jurist, scholar, race theorist, social activist for civil justice, civil rights, a mentor to generations of lawyers. Well, when I was in college, so that lets you know it's been a long time ago, he was just a few years ahead of me in law school, and we met on the steps of the Supreme Court. It was the night before the landmark affirmative action education case, the Bakke case, the University of California Regents v. Bakke. And he talked to us. I mean, we had all night to kill because we were trying to get in for oral arguments the next morning. He talked to me, he talked to my best girlfriend. We both were aspiring to be lawyers. And he talked about how we all, as future lawyers, had a responsibility to use our voice to advocate on behalf of those who don't have a voice. Now, of course, he went on to do just that. My best girlfriend, Pat, she went on to become the Human Rights Commissioner of New York City for over a decade. Ironically, Professor Ogletree came here to Philadelphia about a year and a half ago, and for the first time made the announcement that he has Alzheimer's, but that he was going to use his voice to advocate on behalf of all those African American, Hispanic, and Native Americans who are disproportionately affected by this disease. We all have a responsibility to use our voices to tell this untold story on behalf of our parents, on behalf of our grandparents, on behalf of ourselves, on behalf of the Charles Ogletrees of the world, on behalf of all those people who can't use their voice right now because they are in the throes of battling this disease. That is the untold story that each one of us has a responsibility to tell until the day comes when somebody can get up here and say, the big story is we have a cure.